when I leave my front door, I leave my attendant behind. So with individualized funding, that problem can be easily overcome. That's one of the beauties of it, and that's one of the reasons for it. It's to recognize that people are living full lives and have requirements beyond just the bathroom, bedroom and kitchen when it comes to essential service.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Bill McQueen. Most people choose when they get up, go to bed or go shopping, but many people with disabilities have to plan their schedules around attendant services. Attendants are people who physically assist individuals with disabilities. Right now, most attendant services across the country are provided through agencies or apartment projects. But a new project in Ontario will provide more flexibility and control for people who use these services. Through a program known as Direct Individualized Funding, people will be able to hire and manage their own attendant services. Ing Wong has been following the development of the project since it was announced at a conference in June.
I am extremely happy to be able to tell you that our direct funding pilot project has received approval.
The direct funding pilot project is a new option for people who use attendant service in Ontario. Attendants help people with their daily living needs. Some of these needs include getting out of bed, bathing, and getting dressed so that a disabled person can get on with their life. Currently, attendant services are delivered to people in two forms. A person can apply to an agency that will send an attendant to their home at a set time. This is known as outreach service. Or they can apply to live in an apartment that has in-house attendant service. Attendants are available 24 hours a day. This is known as a support service living unit or an SSLU. While each system helps some people become independent, others are finding that there are limitations. Hazel Self lives in a support service living unit. While she's enjoyed living in her apartment, she feels it's time to move on.
Having spent 15 years in a SLU, it's time for me to explore something new. I really would like to move to a larger apartment, two-bedroom apartment, or a different location. And I'd very much like to have more control over the hiring of my own people who assist me.
But while there are benefits to having direct funding, there are risks too.
There's going to be new demands. I'll have to learn really what it means to be an employer and how to hire and all the sort of legal aspects of that. And that's where the Centre for Independent Living will assist in training and supporting me in doing that. But I certainly feel ready for it and I'd like to try that. Now obviously I wouldn't have the attendant 24 hours a day, so I'll have to work out where my needs most are and how I can fill in the gaps, and so there'll be some creative things to think about, some new challenges.
But for many people, the additional responsibilities are something they want. Joe Ross has also applied to the direct funding pilot project. He used to have his own money to hire his own attendants. This was when he was a student. But due to government bureaucracy, the funding ended when he got a job.
Well, in Belleville, I was getting money through the vocational rehabilitation service while I was going to school. I had an agreement with them. They would reimburse me for the money that I spent on attendant care. So, in fact, I did have individualized funding for that period of time.
How does it compare to what you have now?
It's like night and day. You've got flexibility. If I'm at work and I wanted them to do a couple of errands while I was working, then there'd be no problem with that. They saw my name on the paycheck and no questions.
Flexibility is a huge issue for many people who use attendance services. Direct funding will allow people like Hazel and Joe to have more flexibility.
It means that I, for example, would receive monies directly in order to pay my own attendants, and I wouldn't be receiving that attendance through an agency. So I would have direct control over who I choose to assist me and where I live, and so that's the big difference.
For Joe, having his own money will allow him to be more spontaneous. Currently, he schedules his life around attendance service that has to be booked days in advance.
I have to phone Wheel-Trans and try to arrange transportation, and then I have to phone the place where I live and try to coordinate so that the time that Wheel-Trans gives me fits in with the time I get home for supper. And quite often I wind up I have counted 20 phone conversations to stop to get groceries on the way home. There's no coordination between all these scraps of services. That's what would be resolved by having my own attendant, that all that would be consolidated and put at my disposal.
There are other limitations as well. If Joe wanted to move, he'd have to spend years on waiting lists trying to find another apartment building that could provide him with attendant service. Under direct funding, he'll be able to live where he wants. He can hire his own attendant rather than relying on services that are tied to a building. This means more choices for Joe and people like him. And more choices means freedom.
It means that I would have options. That if something came up, I wouldn't have to wait for hours or days until somebody could accommodate me. I could go out and shop or go to a movie whenever I wanted.
When I leave my front door, I leave my attendant behind. So with individualized funding, that problem can be easily overcome. That's one of the beauties of it, and that's one of the reasons for it. It's to recognize that people are living full lives and have requirements beyond just the bathroom, bedroom, and kitchen when it comes to essential service. Our lives extend beyond that.
We have been routinely denied those sort of freedoms and rights that other people just take for granted.
Joe Ross used to have flexibility in his life. 15 years ago, when he was 20, Joe became seriously injured in a car accident.
I got into a car with someone who had been drinking. It was my roommate. It was during the party season in Christmas season in 1978. Hit a patch of ice and slid into a telephone pole. I was asleep actually in the passenger side, and we hit the pole with my door.
Joe became quadriplegic. Like many people who suddenly become disabled, his family was the only support system he could rely on, so he had to move back home.
I left home when I was about 17 and hitchhiked across the country a couple times, and so I was used to being on my own, and I was quite independent. And when the accident came, I still wanted all that stuff. It was hard to move back at 20.
Joe was used to being on his own, and he wanted to leave home. To do that, he needed the support of attendants, people who could help him get dressed, eat, and go to the bathroom. Joe had two choices. He could use outreach attendant services that would come to wherever he was living. Attendants would come to his home at specific times. But this service, due to limited funding, can only provide 2 to 3 hours of care each day, and this did not meet Joe's needs. So Joe decided to move into an SSLU, an apartment complex that would provide 24-hour attendance service. But this type of housing is in high demand. As a result, the waiting lists are long. Joe was on the waiting list for 10 years to get his apartment.
I didn't want to be a burden on my parents any longer, so I decided to move out. And when I made that decision, then I had to look for other accommodation. I applied to SSLUs in Kingston, Ottawa, Peterborough, Hamilton, Sudbury, and Toronto, and I got this one. It was actually a very difficult process, and harder than finding a job. So the location of the SSLU determined then where I would then look for a job. I was accepted here, and that's why I'm here.
Joe even had to take drastic steps to make sure he was a priority to get his apartment. He had to check himself into the hospital.
I was on waiting lists for 10 years while I was living at home, but I didn't move up the waiting list because I wasn't considered a priority. People in hospitals are considered a priority. So when I finally made the decision that I needed to move out, it just so happened that I was going into the hospital for minor surgery, and when I got there, I just refused to leave. I told them I couldn't go home, I had nowhere to go. And so they were forced to keep me in the hospital. You should have seen the doctors' faces. They couldn't believe that. And I stayed there for 2 or 3 months while I did the search for an SSLU.
Joe checked out of the hospital and moved into his apartment 5 years ago. Since then, he's been living in West End, Toronto, just 40 minutes drive from his workplace. While Joe has gained some independence from living in an SSLU, he wants to take the next step of hiring his own attendants. He'll be able to do this if he becomes part of the direct funding pilot project. If he's part of the project, it means he can set up his own services to suit his needs. And that translates to more flexibility in his personal and professional life. Right now, his situation doesn't allow for much spontaneity. Joe works full-time as a computer consultant with the Federal Environment Ministry. While his colleagues are able to work overtime or go out together after work, Joe has to fit his social life around his attendant services schedule.
I miss out a lot. That's really the upshot of it. If I decided in the morning I wanted to see a movie that evening, if we got into a conversation here at work and somebody said this was a good movie, I wouldn't be able just to go out to that movie that evening.
This kind of planning not only affects Joe's social life, it affects his career as well.
There are certain things that I see as possibly limiting my career. I can't tell my employer that I can be available on a pager, for instance. The same thing applies to coming in on weekends, and I'd just be a lot more flexible and a lot more available if I had my own attendant.
We see a great variability in the kinds of services that people with
To meet the needs of people like Joe, advocates like Vic Willey develop direct funding.
Well, it's more an issue of civil liberties. We have been routinely denied those sort of freedoms and rights that other people just take for granted. For instance, the right to move to another community. Now, on one hand, there's nothing stopping us, but if we don't have the attendant services there and proper housing, we can't move there. Now we can take our attendant services with us.
Direct funding will allow a person to create their own service. Unlike the two current systems, money from the government will be given to an individual rather than an agency. That person has to hire, train, and assess their own attendant, and they take on full responsibility of being an employer. It's a huge responsibility that is not for everyone.
Direct funding is for the individual that has the wherewithal and the desire to be an employer, with all the duties that entails. That includes signing checks, hiring, training, and hiring new staff, even firing staff on occasion.
But according to Ian Parker, who's involved in setting up direct funding, many people feel that it's time for them to take this responsibility for the long-term benefits.
That people will be able to do their own thing. And so often services are arranged according to some kind of critical mass, the critical number of people, and we're thinking in terms of efficiencies when we do that. But in this system, you only need one person.
It follows naturally that we should have the right to move throughout the province, the right to live where we want, to work where we want, and the right to have freedom that other people take for granted. We don't want special rights, we want essentially a level playing field. so that we can fulfill our duties as citizens, so we can get out there and take jobs and, yes, even pay taxes.
It will enable 80 to 100 people who have disabilities to hire their own attendant and be the employer.
For the past 8 years, advocates have lobbied the Ontario government to make direct funding a reality. 4 years ago, the Liberal government promised to set aside money for direct funding. But in autumn of 1990, they were swept out of government by the new Democratic Party. The Liberals' plans to set up a direct funding pilot project went with them.
There has been a change of government, and we had to go back and re-educate the entire government. Luckily, we had some very knowledgeable and supportive people in the bureaucracy, and this government listened to us. And today, the minister has announced that it's going to be a fait accompli, that direct funding will now be available as soon as the mechanism and the operational side can be set up, probably in 3 to 6 months in Ontario.
People like Vic had to convince a new set of decision makers that people with disabilities needed this choice. After months of negotiations, Minister of Health Ruth Greer publicly announced this summer that the government will support a direct funding pilot project.
It will enable 80 to 100 people who have disabilities to hire their own attendant and be the employer of that attendant, which changes the relationship and I think enables those people to live very different lives from the lives they've led in the past. And we will be monitoring it and evaluating it, and I have every confidence that it will demonstrate not only is it cost effective, but in terms of empowering people to take control over their own needs, it will make them healthier people, and that benefits all of us.
If the direct funding pilot project proves to be successful, people like Vic Willey and Ian Parker hope that it will expand.
It finally will acknowledge the expertise and the credibility that people with disabilities know they have themselves. It's going to be recognized by more people.
I would expect that it's going to be an option that the government is going to be looking at increasingly closely. You know, it was invented and it's been protected and controlled by the community of people with disabilities. It's ours and we're not going to give it away. And we've been telling the government for years, this model is efficacious. This model is efficient, and you get the most bang for the buck out of this model. And I expect that this model can be expanded to perhaps elderly people that need those services, perhaps children, younger people. I think this model is going to free up a lot of the latent talent that has been lying around in the community unused, that people are going to be able to get out there and contribute. I think it's very exciting.
But in Ontario, the NDP government will have to call an election soon. And supporters of direct funding hope that this project has full support from all politicians to expand the program.
It really has all party support. Ruth Greer has supported it in the announcement today, and I know that her predecessor also is supporting it in the NDP. The original support came back here at this very site in 1990 from the Liberal Minister then of Community and Social Services, Charles Beer. And in the all-party hearings of Bill 101, a small part of which was the direct funding legislation, they all supported it. So it's almost like one of those sort of basic human rights type things that is widely supported.
Can you open that? We'll just put it in a pile to read.
If the direct funding pilot project proves to be successful, advocates hope that it can be expanded to become an option for more people.
Oh, yeah.
In the meantime, they'll be setting up the framework to ensure that it will work. This will include setting up a support system to teach people how to manage their money and train their attendants. Many people, like Hazel Self, see this as the beginning of a new choice for people with disabilities.
There'll be some exciting results, I'm sure, come out of this pilot, and that it will become the norm and an accepted choice for consumers.
And for Joe Ross, this is the chance to have the same choices as everyone else.
I want the same thing that everybody else, that all the able-bodied people have. I want the same options. I pay the same taxes, and I want to be able to do all the same things. I want the same access to the city, and that includes being able to go where I want, when I want, do my shopping when I want, and having all those things go revolve around my life rather than me having to plan my life around these various activities of daily living.
No, just maybe just a little bit of lemon juice. If I had my own attendant care, I think I would have that feeling, you know, when you wake up in the morning and you're not exactly sure what it is you're going to do that day, but it doesn't matter. You're just free to get up and make a decision and follow it through. All right.
Applications from across Ontario are now being reviewed. The pilot project will be administered by 6 regional independent living centres. We'll keep you updated on the project. Meanwhile, if you'd like to know more about attendant services, write to us. We'll give you our address in a moment. That's our show. DNET will not be seen for the next 2 weeks. We'll see you again the week of December 24th. I'm Bill McQueen, and now here's our address. Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. That's Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. Or you can fax us at area code 416-205-3399. This program is brought to you in part by the Canadian Association of Independent Living Centres, promoting and supporting the development of independent living resource centres across Canada.